Hello, everyone. It's Mike Blackburn. I'm the author of the Canterbury Construction Report. I'm here today, joined by New Zealand's resident builder, Pete Wolfcamp. How are you, mate?
Yeah, really nice to talk to you, Mike. Very well, thank you.
Very good. Hey, how's that renovation of yours going?
Oh, well, this isn't renovation. This is the glories of living in an older house, is the constant care and maintenance. And in my case, having to rework done that I did 20 years ago because paint doesn't last forever. Certainly LSOP treatment timber doesn't last forever. I've learned that. So yeah, look, I love the old houses, but I certainly understand why we don't build like we did 100 years ago.
It's a passion project, isn't it, Pete?
Absolutely. And look, I've essentially all of my work up until quite recently has been exclusively heritage work. So I love it. I love the authenticity. I love the craftsmanship of it. But it also then, living in an older house and knowing now what you can see with advances in terms of, air tightness and moisture control and that sort of thing. The option of building new is kind of attractive as well, to be fair.
Look, and that's the exact reason why we're here today.
Yeah.
Obviously, over the last 6 months, 12 months, ministers Bishop and Pink have really stirred up the construction sector with a whole range of proposed new changes and legislation, which is going to be designed to make it easier, cheaper, faster to build houses. And obviously, just the other day, probably the most significant announcement, which we've had forecast to us, is that the minister's now proposing to give certain builders the ability to sign off on some of their own work. Now, there are some limitations to that, and that's really what I sort of want to talk to you about today, Pete. So what's your take on these new regulations?
Look, broadly speaking, I think there's space in the industry to accommodate this sort of change and development, right? Certainly, the response from some more cautious people in the sector is, look, that would go well if every time we as professionals went to a site, we didn't find a problem. And we do. And we sometimes find problems with builds that are being supervised seemingly by well qualified and experienced people, but we're still finding problems. So and even like I'll often, especially going back to the block, and I guess this is kind of what informs a lot of my thinking around it. We would kind of do that on an audit basis. So I would say to the LBPs on site, look, you guys fix off the plasterboard lining, the bracing units, make sure you put your screws in 50-50, 75-75, that sort of thing. And I'll come through and record it and I can let the inspector know. And the number of times that I'd come along and I'd go, guys, you've done it wrong. It's either a screw in the corner or too many screws, and it's just got to be as it is on the plan, right? Or on the guide. So I can see where the concern is coming from, but at the same time, I think we do need to speed things up. In a nutshell, I think the problem that government have got, national government, not the national government, but nationwide government, the stumbling block seems to be the BCAs, which are the councils effectively.
Yes.
And I've got a lot of time for the councils, but they're always the one holding the can, right? So
Yes, yeah.
if you are always going to be last man standing, which is exactly the case with councils across the country who have spent billions of dollars paying people out, then you're going to be risk averse. So it's really about risk and who takes risk. So looping back to which companies are going to be afforded the opportunity, the privilege of self-certifying, and then how do we as consumers know that they'll be around in 10 years' time if there's a problem?
Right. So,
That
so
part.
So the minister said yesterday
Yep.
that these new regulations are likely to initially be limited to around about 3,000 houses a year. Now currently across
Right.
New Zealand, we're building 34,000 houses a year, certainly well down
Yes.
from the peak over the last couple of years. So that really is about 8 or 9% of all of the houses that are
Yeah.
built across New Zealand in a 12-month period. So it's a relatively small percentage. And you and I talked yesterday about who those companies might be. So look, let's not name any names at
No.
this stage, but it's really only likely to be a handful of companies who are going to tick the required boxes to meet these requirements.
Yeah. And I think, I would imagine from government's point of view, the main concern is if there is a problem later on, do they have the right sort of insurances, the right sort of structure to accommodate that? Because we're not going to be there. Councils aren't going to be there. So I guess if companies can prove that, and they can prove their competency through, you and I have both been at conferences where, for example, 𝗕𝗹𝗰𝗙𝗂𝗰𝗙 from Auckland Council, has presented data on these are the number of inspections that fail and so on. They can track
Yes.
that through, and they should be able to track that through to a specific company and go, actually, we've noticed that in fact they don't fail that many, or they fail less than the average. Therefore, we have some confidence that they know
Yes.
what they're doing.
And look, I mentioned before that some councils, and particularly one I'm most familiar with is the Selwyn District Council. They've been running a professional partnership program for probably the
Right.
last couple of years, and it's exactly that same premise: is that if you can prove that you can fill out a building consent application properly, and that the quality of your workmanship over a series of inspections ticks the boxes, then they're going to
Yep.
give you the benefit of the doubt. Isn't probably the right phrase, but you have demonstrated that you can actually build a quality house, and therefore a lot of these self sign-off things. And again, it's not going to be blanket across the board. There's still
No.
building inspectors are still going to be required to come out and do a series of inspections. But some of those
Yes.
low risk options where you don't need to, and whether they be done by remote inspection videos
Yep.
or taking photographs are all options to just make it easier on that process.
There is a couple of things around that though, because I think it's really important. I want to sort of commend, I suppose, this administration. We know, and you pointed out, it's 8 or 9%. It might be 3,000 houses in total, which is a small number of the total number of houses that we need to get built every year. But it's a step in the right direction. And I think sometimes with the building sector, we're waiting for one answer, the perfect answer that solves all of the problems, and it's just not there. So
No.
let's take the advantages, take the wins where we can get them. And this potentially, I think, could be a win, as long as we keep our eye on the fact that it's the consumer that we need to protect at the end of the day.
So look, that brings me on to my next question, because obviously one of the things that the minister has forecast is that along with the ability to sign off on your own
Yeah.
work, there comes an increase in penalties for those people who don't do good work. Have you had any indication as to how that might be overseen, or what those penalties might be?
I looked at some of that, and look, to be fair, it's an entertaining Sunday's afternoon reading, is to go to the LVP website and read through the disciplinary hearings, right? And the findings of that. So it's not like the system doesn't exist. There are already penalties. I think, like with many things, it just takes too long to make these determinations. So, maybe in due process and natural justice are really important. But if it takes 12 months or so for someone who's come in front of the board to get a determination and for the public to know about it, then maybe that part of it needs to speed up. And yeah, maybe, instead of the occasional, oh, we're going to suspend your license, maybe it's just a flat out, that's it. You can never be registered again. Go and find another employment. It's look, someone used this phrase the other day, which I quite like. Every now and then you got to hang a rabbit on the fence, right? So maybe we do need to make an example of some really shoddy work and ensure that these people can't continue to operate.
Look, and look, one of the things that makes great media headlines is, builder rips off little old lady.
Yeah,
And with all due respect to little old ladies out there, look, there are some dodgy people in our industry,
yep,
and of course it makes great media headlines. But let's be clear, Pete, for all of the houses and renovations that get done,
100%.
this is actually a relatively small
It's
percentage of
yeah.
of bad eggs, really, isn't it? It's not like we've got a corrupt industry at all.
No, 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 I don't, I agree. What I hope also comes out of this, and I understand sort of within the ministers' circles and within government, there's a bit of talk about this, is that right now, under the LBP scheme, there's a fair amount of criticism that it's too easy to become registered, right?
Yes, yeah, I've heard
I
that.
don't
Yep,
know
yep.
that government are interested in increasing the criteria to become registered, because now that you've got a restricted building work system, you need lots of LVPs to undertake the work. But so I'm a licensed building practitioner. I have a carpentry license. I have a Site 1 license. What I would like to see is that we start to introduce some tiers into the carpentry license.
Hmm.
So maybe carpentry 1, 2, and 3, and that you graduate through those by either proving your experience, proving learning, a track record that allows someone and allows councils, for example, to go, oh, okay, so this guy that's rung up for a building inspection, they're a carpentry 3 license. We know that in order to achieve that level of certification, they must have proved themselves. And therefore, maybe it's only going to be, if they introduce it, people with level 2 or level 3 that can go for some of the remote inspections, for example, or a little bit more freedom around signing off some of your own work.
Right. Actually, now that leads in nicely to my next question about industry training.
Yeah.
There was a report released in August of last year out of Brands talking about the ways that we can improve the building consent process, and it squarely pointed the finger at
Yep.
builders and applicants in general for their inability to fill out a building consent form properly. Now, you and I both know that that's not the only problem in the industry, but with ongoing changes and H1 is a really good example, and anything else that
Sure.
might come through. Have you heard anything about how or what or if there's going to be any ongoing training? And you mentioned about tiers in the LBP system. How do we get builders through that process to improve the way they do things?
Although saying that, builders are not typically the ones submitting consents, right? So if we've got consents that constantly get RFIs, and I had a look through that Brands report as well, I think it's really important to recognise, because I think the assumption or the way in which the story has been played out in the media is that somehow councils are using the 20-day, that's their statutory requirement to process a building consent. They get to day 18, realise they haven't had a cup of tea, send out an RFI, and that gives them time to go and have a cup of tea. Now, that's not always the case, I think. It's probably very rare. But I'm sure that what does happen is they get building consents submitted that are poor, right? And so
Mhm.
people have done a bad job of their design, and therefore council needs to ask for that. One of the interesting things that has been talked about is, will building consents go through one central processing facility? So in
Yes,
the future,
yes.
they all get uploaded through one portal. And look, bit of blue sky thinking, is that an opportunity for AI to scan these
Mhm.
consents and go, hey, you've missed this, 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 and this. And we can tell by scanning it in 5 minutes with AI, send it straight back. So I think there's some opportunities to speed that up. Just in terms of building training, um, I think we've got a deeper issue there, and it goes back to, I guess, us as building professionals, whether we see ourselves as being professional, and kind of a general approach to building in New Zealand, and BCITO did some research. They tried to figure out what our attitudes to life in the trades is, right? And by and large, we're not held in high regard, right? And sometimes I think for ourselves, we don't see
Better than
ourselves as
politicians.
being, yeah, well, yeah, probably yeah, and just above car salesmen, with the greatest respect to them. But yeah, I think overall we like. you and I would go out, we'd go to a building site, we'd see some outstanding work done by motivated, committed, diligent, professional building professionals, right? And then we'd also travel a mile down the road and go to a building site where it's just rubbish, right? It's there's rubbish on the ground, there's rubbish that they're building.
Yes, yep.
So, you know, is part of that solution, part of us getting to get upskilled is to feel that what we do is valuable, right? So I want to keep learning. I want to keep expanding my knowledge. I'm recognized for my knowledge, and therefore I want to keep training. Um, there's some bigger sort of underlying societal issues that we might have to try and work on there as well, in a
Yeah,
sense.
but look, the other side of that coin, Pete, is that
Mm,
things aren't necessarily consistent across BCAs either,
yep,
are they? I mean, look, I talk to builders, certainly here in
yep,
Canterbury. A builder may work across 3 or 4 different councils, and one of the things that I hear constantly is that they will receive different RFI questions for the
yeah.
exact same build across different councils. Inspectors are looking for different things, and so that's a frustrating thing that I hear back from the builders themselves as to another challenge in the industry.
I think sometimes when you're on site and you encounter a building inspector that goes, "Oh no, I don't like that," or "We don't do it that way," as you go, there is only one building code, remember? And I
Yes,
mean, we had
yes,
in
that's
Auckland
true.
years ago, where Auckland Council inspector would have a different approach to North Shore, have a different approach to Manukau, and I'd go, "There's only one building code, mate. Just pick your lane, stick to it." So yeah, in territorial authorities, okay, there might be a particular interest around something in the South Island that's different to the North Island. But we've got to keep reminding the BCAs and the territorial authorities there's only one building code.
That's right. Look, Pete, just to wrap this up, look, the
Mm,
government has moved pretty fast to make some of these changes. Look, obviously, we're still to see some of the legislative details and some of the fine print as to what and who and where and how. But how give it a rating? Where do you think they're on the right track? Do you think that these improvements are going to be successful and good for the industry?
yeah, look, I would. I mean, I noticed in the Herald today all the ministers are getting ranked, so it's only fair that we get to rank the government as well. Look, I think I'm a bit of an optimist, so I'd give it a solid 7 out of 10, right? But I think what most of us would applaud is the fact that there is some action, right? There is a desire to go. What we've been doing hasn't been working. In terms of whether that's the importation of building products, right? So
Hmm,
if
hmm.
it's of a suitable quality and you can prove its provenance and so on, we should be able to do that. 60 square meter buildings, step out a 60 square meter building. It's not that small. And the idea of being able to
70,
cobble
but
that together without,
Pete,
it
it's going
might
to
be
be
70
70
square.
square meters.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I heard that some ministers were keen on making it 120, which is
Oh,
quite something. But look, it again, I don't think it doesn't change everything, but it changes small elements. It provides opportunity perhaps to do something to help housing affordability. Um,
yes, yep.
the other thing I think that one of the announcements that we haven't heard yet that I think would be good to hear from government is mandatory insurance for
Oh,
contractors.
yeah. Well, look. Well, in order
Yeah,
to have
look at
mandatory
that.
insurance, you've got to have an insurer who provides a policy, and
Sure thing. You do. Yep.
which there is not an option available in New Zealand, because both you and I know that master builders and certified builders through their own products are basically
Mm,
self-insurance, and
yeah.
I bet that there's absolutely no appetite from the government to underwrite anything.
And look, I might actually put that to Chris Pink when he comes on the show in a couple of weeks' time. But I again, I was just in a discussion with a guy who's very experienced with building in Sweden, right? So we've got to look to other jurisdictions, and what helps control and regulate the quality of the work is that everyone has compulsory insurance, and that if a client has a problem 5 years down the track with a shower leaking, they just ring their insurer and the
Yes.
insurer
Yep.
sorts it out, you know.
Hmm.
So if we are going to move to relieve councils of the burden of
Hmm.
essentially being that insurer, we do need to have another system in place. But we're a small country, a long way from everywhere else, and whether or not we can get an insurer to come here and stay here
Hmm.
is a genuine problem.
My understanding is that in the UK, you can't get a mortgage to build a new house without insurance. So maybe
Right.
a blanket coverage like that might make it a little bit more attractive for an international player to come in. Listen, look, the last thing I want to just talk about before we wrap this up is there's been a lot of talk about um, potential for leaky building syndrome. Again, with all of these changes, and from what I've seen of ministers' statements and the talk within some of the ministries that are tasked with delivering this stuff,
Mm.
I feel quite confident that the changes are going to be very, very well regulated, rolled out in such a way as this isn't a open slather for everyone to do anything they like. My understanding is that these changes are going to be very, very well implemented and very well overseen. It may be the beginning of something a little bit wider, but I'm the commentary that I've seen for some of the disaster possibilities. I don't necessarily believe.
Yeah, and look, I've mentioned before, I'm an optimist, right? So I think that some of these things will hopefully provide some solutions without causing an enormous amount of problems. And I think you're right to emphasize the fact that, the self-certification or the remote inspections or the 70 square meter dwellings, it's not going to be every house that gets built or every apartment or multi-dwelling that gets built. It's going to be some, and it will provide some freedom that will allow hopefully some more affordability. It's not going to be every single house. And in terms of leaky building, I look, I was building during that time. I probably built some stuff that I'm probably not particularly proud of at that time. But at the same time, I don't think this is like that. Um, but I also realize too that I probably need to spend a bit more time on sites where there is really poor quality work happening.
Mhm.
And you could go to one of those today. And so it's how do we make sure that we get rid of those people out of the industry,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
and promote really good practice among builders that want to take responsibility for their work and stick around to fix problems should they occur.
It's very good because look, without question, we need to be building more houses.
Yeah, we do. And that's all about affordability. That the ultimate goal, I think, is about affordability, right?
Yes, yep.
And it's also about replacing stock that's no longer fit for
Of course,
purpose.
yep. Hmm.
I think once you get out of the main centres, we've got too many people living in poor quality housing.
Yes,
And one of the things I'm more and more passionate around is that poor quality housing leads to poor outcomes in terms of our society. So, yeah, I think it's a really big issue that we've got to fix. Um, look, overall, I sense that it's a step in the right direction, is how I would summarize it.
very good, very good. Hey, Pete, look, it's been fabulous to chat. There's obviously a range of other issues that will come up that I think we should talk about again. But look, for the time being, I really
Yeah,
appreciate your
absolutely.
time. Thanks for your comments.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mike.
Okay.